This video is about the three best-known moral arguments for or against abortion to which ethics students are typically introduced in a basic introductory ethics course in the USA. And they are the positions of Judith Jarvis Thompson, Mary Ann Warren, and Dom Marquis, and we'll see what those positions are. Before we go there, this is Dorje Dima. She's a Bhutanese archer. Most Americans probably don't even know where Bhutan is. It's a neighboring country in the Himalayas, next door to Nepal. We have a Nepali student in this class. So in 2005, Dorje competed in the Asian Archery Championship in South Korea when she was 7 months pregnant. She said 7 months pregnant was a little tricky time for her as far as competition because every time she'd take aim, the baby moved on the inside, which was a bit distracting. Then in 2008, when she was 3 months pregnant, she competed at the Beijing Olympics. And so this is her competing at 3 months pregnant in 2008 in Beijing. And the point being is to be pregnant does not mean that there's a complete cessation of all activities and things that one is capable of, which sometimes I find my students seem to think. Okay, this is just a cool picture. Sorry, there's no targets here. All these are expectant moms and their baby bumps. But still, the focus is on that what it is that we're aiming for is the good, the right, and the ought. But obviously, there's no targets in this particular picture. All right, before we get into this talk, just real quickly, on the left-hand side of this flow chart are ethics of conduct. So ethics of conduct begins with utilitarianism, with the theories of Bentham and Mill. And these are theories that look past the actual act itself to the outcomes or to the consequences and decide on the basis of those consequences. In the case of Bentham, primarily on the basis of pleasure. In the case of Mill, primarily on the basis of happiness. The second theory, still an ethic of conduct, what should we do, is deontology, which literally means the study of duty. And Immanuel Kant is the one who is most especially identified with deontology. Deontology has three ingredients, so to speak, in its reasoning process. One must begin with a good will, which kind of enervates or drives or motivates whatever gifts, skills, abilities that we have. And then from that good will, we have to reason using the two forms of the categorical imperative. One, which is a principle of universalization, and the other one, which is the ends means principle. We'd never treat people as just a means to an end, but as ends in themselves. So moving away from ethics of conduct that say, what should I do? We now move over to ethics of character, which say, what should I be? What does it look like for me to be a woman or a man of virtue in this situation? Thus, it's known as virtue ethics, and it's Aristotle and Anscombe who are most especially associated with that theory. And I'm going to keep on harping on this, guys, because your final exam, you're going to be doing an analysis of one of 5 moral dilemmas using all 3 schools. All right, so today's talk is focus on abortion, and we'll start right out with Judith Jarvis Thompson. She says, and this was in your reading, now let me ask you to imagine this. You wake up in the morning and you find yourself back to back in bed. The idea is you went out on a bender last night and somebody grabbed hold of you and abducted you, and so you find yourself in bed with an unconscious violinist, a famous unconscious violinist. Itzhak Perlman, maybe, I don't know. He has been found to have a fatal kidney ailment, and the Society of Music Lovers has canvassed all the available medical records and found that you alone have the right blood type to help. They've therefore kidnapped you, and last night the violinist's circulatory system was plugged into yours so that your kidneys can be used to extract poisons from his blood as well as your own. The director of the hospital now tells you, look, we're sorry the Society of Music Lovers did this to you. We would never have permitted if we had known. But still they did it, and the violinist is now plugged into you. To unplug you would be to kill him, but never mind, it's only for 9 months. By then he will have recovered from his ailment and can safely be unplugged from you. Is it morally incumbent, she asks, on you to accede or to give in to this situation? By the way, Judith Jarvis Thompson is the philosopher who tweaked Philippa Foot's idea of the trolley problem and gave us Spur. Spur is the version of the trolley problem where do we push the fat man over the bridge? So she likes, obviously, she's still alive, she's in her 90s. She likes thought experiments. So She goes on to say, all persons have a right to life, and violinists are persons. Granted, you have a right to decide what happens in and to your body, but a person's right to life outweighs your right to decide what happens in and to your body. That's what they're telling you. So you cannot ever be unplugged from him, at least not until he's recovered, right? So that's her thought experiment. She says that pregnancy is like unto that. So the next one is a gal who died young, a philosopher who died fairly young, Mary Ann Warren, and hers is a little bit more sophisticated, and it's not really a thought experiment, it's a claim. She says, only if we refute the claim that fetuses are human persons, and as such members of the moral community, can we show abortion to be morally permissible. So what gave rise to her taking this approach was early on in the days following Roe v. Wade, 1973, with a Supreme Court ruling that gave us legalized abortion. It was usually stated that the developing human within the mother's uterus was just a mass of cells, until fiber optics allowed us to look within the womb, and then we realized, no, it's not. It's not just a developing mass of cells. The morphology of the body is very much human very early on. And we find out that we have heartbeat and we have brain waves early on. So kind of that way of arguing was done away with. So Mary Ann Warren comes up with a new way to argue, and she realized we have to refute the idea that fetuses are human persons. She says the traditional anti-abortion or pro-life argument fails to distinguish between the moral sense of human being, which implies full membership in the moral community, and the genetic sense, which implies membership only in the human species and not the human moral community. This is a distinction that she's making, and she feels that it's a significant distinction. She argues that moral humanity follows not from simple genetic humanity, but from personhood, which is a concept with central characteristics that include, number 1, sentience, number 2, emotionality, number 3, reason, which is an awful lot like sentience, number 4, the capacity to communicate, number 5, self-awareness, and number 6, moral agency. She says, moreover, the rights of the fetus as a potential person cannot outweigh the moral rights of the actual person who wishes to have an abortion. So that's her argument, and so she's saying there's two kinds of humanity. One of them is genetic, and the other one is moral. And she's arguing that the moral should have precedence over the genetic. So this next fella, Marquis, this philosopher, he died the year after my parents were born, and I am 63. Okay, he died in 1937. So this is an old argument. He says the anti-abortionist charges not unreasonably that pro-choice principles concerning killing are too narrow to be acceptable. The pro-choicer charges not unreasonably that anti-abortionist principles concerning killing are too broad to be acceptable. So the Future Like Ours, FLO, account of the wrongness of killing, in that account of the wrongness of killing, Marquis suggests that in order to make progress in the abortion debate, which was going on a long time ago, we need to do two things. First, we need to figure out why killing innocent adults is wrong, i.e., what property adults have that renders their being killed as wrong. Second, we need to figure out whether killing fetuses involves the same morally problematic features as that of killing adults. He says the wrongness of killing us is understood in terms of what killing does to us. Killing us imposes on us the misfortune of premature death. That misfortune underlies the wrongness. My death deprives me of my future, if the life that I would have lived if I had lived out a natural span is taken from me, is the idea. He says the misfortune of premature death consists of the loss to us of the future goods of consciousness. The goods of life are whatever we get out of life. The goods of life are those items towards which we take a pro-attitude. They are completed projects of which we are proud, the pursuit of our goals, aesthetic enjoyments, friendships, intellectual pursuits, and physical pleasures of various sorts. And he says premature death is a misfortune because it deprives an individual of a future of value. What makes killing wrong in general, he says, is that it deprives us of a future of value. Thus, killing someone is wrong in general when it deprives her of a future like ours. He claims that the flow account explains why it was just as wrong to kill you while you were a fetus or an infant as it would be to kill you now. Okay, so here's the thing. These three arguments are the standard three that someone considering abortion from the standpoint of philosophy in a secular ethics class is usually exposed to. I'm going to hit the pause button here and say, when one is actually considering abortion, one isn't thinking through these things. One is thinking in a more of a very existential way. This is a very theoretical approach to the whole thing. But the point that each of them is making is fairly obvious, and the possible objections to each of them are also, I think, fairly obvious. Excuse me. Excuse me. Judith Jarvis Thompson's scenario really only applies to cases of pregnancy as a result of rape. I mean, it doesn't fit with anything else. This is interestingly a critique that many pro-choice philosophers have made of it. They say, well, there's a great argument for rape, but it doesn't work for the case of consensual sex. Additionally, it would be more compelling, this thought experiment, if it didn't have the concept of complete immobility in a hospital bed for a long period of time as a part of its depiction of pregnancy. Pregnant women can still do many things, including like win competitions in archery when they are 7 months pregnant. Their lives are not quite so truncated as this thought experiment depicts. So that's the obvious criticisms against Thompson. There's not much more to say there. Mary Ann Warren's is a complex idea and proposal that she puts forward. So her argument makes a distinction between what it means to be a human genetically and what it means to be a human in terms of morality. And she says that the concept of personhood must include sentience, emotionality, reason, the capacity to communicate, self-awareness, and moral agency. Well, anyone who's been the parent of a newborn or even of a 1-year-old child must realize that this argument challenges the personhood of their baby. Sentience and reason are fairly close to being synonyms. So we use sentience in such a way as to mean the ability to reason as over against the ability to feel. Sentience and reason are capacities that increase and grow in human beings over the course of the lifespan. Whether the baby is in utero or whether the baby has been born, they're still fairly in a very much developmental phase. Warren uses emotionality as a trait of personhood as well. So by definition, this is just straight from Wikipedia, emotionality is the observable behavioral and physiological component of emotion. It's a measure of a person's emotional reactivity to a stimulus. Well, the advent of fiber optics allowed us to peer within the womb of the developing human. We now know that infants cry within the womb in response to pain and other stimuli as early as 28 weeks into a pregnancy. So emotionality clearly is there, at least at the point of 28 weeks into the pregnancy. Warren held that the capacity to communicate is another trait that denotes personhood. As with sentience, that's another capacity that grows across the lifespan. So regarding this criteria, children with severe forms of cerebral palsy, adults with locked-in syndrome, who didn't begin that way but are now in that condition, and children who are pre-verbal all don't pass this test for personhood. Self-awareness is the next capacity which Warren said helped to constitute personhood. Self-awareness is how an individual consciously knows and understands their own character, feelings, motives, and desires. Clearly, that's a capacity concerning which some adults have deficiencies. I offer up narcissists, for an example. We talk about them not being self-aware. As with sentience and communication, this capacity tends to grow across time. Arguably, newborns and children up to 8 months old, this has to do with brain development, are completely lacking in this trait. So last on Warren's list is moral agency. Rational thought and deliberation regarding moral choices are necessary for one to have moral agency. And once again, this is not something that's fully formed in young children. So as one looks at Warren's list of the traits that constitute moral personhood, it becomes clear that all of these capacities which she lists, other than emotionality, are lacking in young children. And it's doubtful that Warren would have defended infanticide, but her categories could be used quite effectively in order to argue for infanticide, which I think calls into question the legitimacy of this approach to categorizing personhood in this fashion. It seems to be arbitrary, and that's the primary critique of Warren. Marquis is a philosopher from a different era. He died when Judith Jarvis Thompson was 8 years old, and 9 years before the late Mary Ann Warren was born. So it gives you an idea of how long ago he lived. His argument is that the future like ours his argument is called the flow or future like ours argument. He says that abortion deprives a developing human of the same thing that murder deprives an adult of: the chance to experience completed projects of which we are proud. These are examples of the sorts of pleasures that the future might hold potentially. The pursuit of our goals, aesthetic enjoyments, friendships, intellectual pursuits, and physical pleasures of various sorts. It takes away all the potential promise of a flow, a future like ours. There are many critiques of Marquis' argument, but one of the most compelling is that of David Boonin in his book A Defense of Abortion. He brings in Judith Jarvis Thompson, by the way. I'm leaving out that part, but you already have heard about Judith Jarvis Thompson. He argues that organized cortical brain activity, which does not occur in the developing human in utero until somewhere between the 25th, right around viability, and the 32nd week after conception, is what is necessary to give weight to Marquis' argument. So he's saying that Marquis' argument really doesn't pertain until we reach about the stage of viability, which is in the 3rd trimester. Organized cortical brain activity must be present in order for a being to be capable of conscious experience. Prior to having a conscious experience, a being has no desires. That's Boonin's argument. Desires are essential for there to be actual personhood, in his view, and he's not alone in that view. That's a view that a lot of philosophers hold. Now, the developing fetus acquires organized cortical brain activity between 25 and 32 weeks of gestation. Therefore, the fetus has no right to life prior to organized cortical brain activity. That's Boonin's argument. There is admittedly a degree of arbitrariness to Boonin's marker of organized cortical activity, but the point is that the developing human has not had sufficient brain development until this occurs to be able to have a sense of its inability to achieve its desires for life, even just a seed of that, a seed concept of that. A fetus under 28 weeks old does not possess that particular brain state which has had conscious experience, and thus does not yet have the capacity to desire a right to life. It has not yet passed the mile marker in human development of organized cortical brain activity. Therefore, it is, in Boonin's estimate, only latently human, but not fully human. So, in closing, we're going to just end here. Peter Singer, who's a famous Australian philosopher who has taught at a number of top schools in the United States, most recently, I believe, Princeton. He says this in his book, Writings on an Ethical Life. The liberal search for a morally crucial dividing line between the newborn baby and the fetus has failed to yield any event or stage of development that can bear the weight of separating those with a right to life from those who lack such a right. He's not criticizing the pro-choice position. What he's doing is he's arguing for infanticide. He's saying, if you use whatever you might use, whether it's heartbeat or brain waves or quickening, when life is first felt, or viability, or whatever you might use, or birth itself, it's all arbitrary. To the dismay of the popular pro-choice advocates, Singer rejects birth as a relevant dividing line between person and non-person, agreeing with pro-life advocates that there is no, as to its isness, its essence, ontologically is what that word is. There's no ontologically significant difference between the fetus and a newborn. As to their essence, there's no significant difference. It's just a matter of where are they. True, there are differences of size, location, dependency, and development, but these are, says Singer, morally irrelevant. Singer believes that the parents of severely handicapped children should have the right to end their children's lives after birth. Here is Singer in his popular applied ethics textbook, Practical Ethics. He said, human babies are not born self-aware or capable of grasping that they exist over time. They are not persons. He goes on to say that animals are self-aware, and therefore, he says, the life of a newborn is of less value than the life of a pig, a dog, or a chimpanzee. That's concerning that he would say that. Singer recommends that a period of 28 days after birth might be allowed before an infant is accepted as having the same right to live as others. And the question is how do we put a fence at the edge of abortion so that we don't go over the cliff of abortion into infanticide? And Singer is saying we don't need to. He's arguing for infanticide. I think that's it. Let's see. Do I have more? Okay. Folks, there is an extra credit threaded class-wide canvas, not your small groups discussion, so it's the whole group, 50-something students, that has been put up which addresses this issue. After an introduction to Singer's claims, it asks this question: is infanticide morally wrong, the killing of already born babies? If so, why? If not, why not? And we'll end there.